who should be in power that will further our interests as a country from a national security perspective. And if it's the Sinaloa backing a president that we think from a national security perspective, right, is going to do what we want them to do, whether that's right or wrong, we are going to back that cartel because they are the ones then backing that government party. I think that's where it's coming from, because that's what we saw a lot of in Colombia, quite frankly, obviously with the FARC and Uribe and all of that. When the CIA was involved in that, right? There's no question. But they were backing those that they felt would further our political goals. It's actually more about politics.
Just through the years of going over this subject with cartel, with America and money, right? There's corruption obviously involved in here somewhere. But a lot of the conversation in drugs always stems back to the CIA, whether the CIA's involvement with the cocaine, whether it was CIA's involvement with destabilizing certain countries. And currently right now, you have just talk about the two major cartels, right? CJ&G and the Sinaloa cartel. Those are two big ones that stick out to me right now. And there's a lot of say that the CIA is involved with helping the Sinaloa cartel take over during certain times when other cartels were a little bit less manageable, almost like the better enemy. And then now just recently, the capture of El Mayo, very interesting stuff. But right away, El Mayo has ties to California, which essentially several informers that we have internally told us about the connections to the CIA. And so I just keep hearing the CIA in every part of this conversation, and I just don't understand what was the big picture of it. And is it CIA being corrupted, or do they really see a big picture in like fostering the power of the cartel and the money in that corruption? I don't understand it really. And I know there's not really a question there other than why is the CIA in all of these conversations I have with every single person that comes in here, from law enforcement to former cartel guys who spent 20 years in prison?
Again, that's not an offensive question, just so you know. Like, I'm not personally offended. First of all, I can't obviously speak to it in depth because I did not work cartels, right? I did not work counter narcotics at the CIA. So I want to be clear about that. But what I can speak about is just from a broad sense, right? In terms of what they do. I do think there is a pervasive ideology that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Right. So starting at the very base level of that, I do think that that's where some of that comes from. Now, let's just take the Sinaloa cartel, for example, just because I agree with you. It is probably one of the largest ones right now. I think part of the thing is if you just look at the cartels themselves, right? We know that those cartels, whether we want to admit it or not, do back certain people for president of Mexico, right? We know that they back certain parties that are willing to take a hands-off approach. Let's just put it that way to them. I think you would agree with that. I think most people would agree with that. And so I think the CIA sees it from that perspective, not the cartel perspective. Who should be in power that will further our interests as a country from a national security perspective? And if it's the Sinaloa backing a president that we think from a national security perspective, right, is going to do what we want them to do, whether that's right or wrong, we are going to back that cartel because they are the ones then backing that government party. I think that's where it's coming from, because that's what we saw a lot of in Colombia, quite frankly, obviously with the FARC and Uribe and all of that. When the CIA was involved in that, right? There's no question. But they were backing those that they felt would further our political goals. It's actually more about politics, in my opinion. It is about the cartels themselves. Now, is there a serious moral problem with backing probably the largest cartel, most violent cartel, right? In Mexico, 1,000,000%, because we're backing them with American money, right? And American support. And that's, for lack of a better word, gross, right? That's hugely problematic. But it's no different. And I'm not saying this is right, but it's no different than if we look at Afghanistan, right? Where we know opium is the largest export out of Afghanistan. And the Taliban is operating very much like a cartel in terms of how they are dealing with that. We backed that in the 80s, right? Because that to us was better than communism, was better than Russia. That is how we are looking at it. Now, it doesn't feel good to say that, right? But I think we have to acknowledge that. And so for us, because we didn't want Afghanistan to fall to the Soviets or fall to that communist ideology, even though the Taliban were war and drug lords, I mean, that's what they were doing, right? We still backed them. Obviously, that backfired on us 20 years later. We know that. But that's the same thing, in my opinion, that is going on with the cartels in Mexico. It's less about like the drugs and the cartels themselves and more about the politics that they support. Does that help at all?
Yeah, no, it's great. It's gonna lead me to the next thing is, the last 4 years we had an administration who kind of was hands off as well on our end. And we could say that I don't want to make this a politically left, right, anything other than it was a very open border, which is very dangerous for our own country. And we all kind of know that, right?
Totally agree.
What do you think? And this is more just of a question of your experience. And again, is, now we have an administration that is shutting down the border, right? And so to me, it feels like the right choice. But then this ripple effect goes downward into the cartel side of things. And I'm curious to see what happens there. But then it starts to raise the question, like, was there some kind of agreement plan? And I don't want to be conspiracy by any means, but it just feels very odd that the cartels have been able to kind of run wild however they wanted to, and now they can't. I think we're going to run into some backlash to that at some point, which is okay. But for 4 years, we just allowed it to flow, and it almost feels like, does that mean there was some kind of partnership in the sense? That's a very crazy question, but I'm very curious to know what you think, in the sense of like, we went from almost no rules to now we definitely have, repercussions for their actions.
I just want to be sure I understand what you're asking. So what you're saying is that we went through basically 4 years of no border rules, right? Like in terms of who's coming in and out. And so do we feel like that was a deal that was struck with the previous administration? Is that kind of what I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, because for someone like me who's lived both the lives of like the security of it, the law enforcement of it, all of it, I didn't get too emotionally invested in, other than the fact that I kept saying, like, what do you gain from this? Like, what does the administration gain from this? What does the country gain from this? And I found nothing that was of value. It found more fear. Like, this is scary, right? And so then I'm like, well, if none of us gain from it, the higher ups, do they gain from it? Is there someone in this decision making train gain value, whether financially or corruption? I don't know, but that's I couldn't come up with an idea. So then it felt like there's something odd to me about that. And I don't think that's a CIA thing. I think it's above that. I think there's something weird about not putting up some boundaries that directly help and assist almost the cartel in action.
I actually totally agree with what you're saying. And I think it's not conspiratorial in nature. It's human in nature, right? Like, why would we engage in diplomacy with another country if we weren't going to get something out of it, right? Like, isn't that the whole point? Like, that is the whole point. And I do agree with you, again, not absolving the CIA, but I do think it's way bigger than that. No offense to the CIA. I do think immigration and border policy it is political, right? Because different politicians make different rules and deals depending on what they do and don't support. I actually fully agree that the past 4 years under the previous administration, how we treated the border was unacceptable, like full stop. Full stop. And it was sort of this like open field day, right? On people and terrorist drugs, whatever, coming through. And that is hugely problematic. I think that what we probably got out of it had to most likely do with goods, services, and lowered tariffs and taxes on our goods as a result of that, because I think money talks, right? And so I think from our perspective, again, I don't know. I obviously didn't work in the Biden administration. I have no idea how they would have benefited from that. But that to me is where it always goes back to is, did they then in turn make financial policies that we, the US, benefited from as a result of that? But then I think as like a responsible leader, you need to take a step back and be like, okay, maybe we need to meet in the middle here so that it's not this like free for all. Because I think we had veered too far over. I personally think it was financial, what we were getting out of them. We don't, this sounds like callous to say, but I'll just be honest. We don't necessarily need intelligence from the Mexicans regarding, terrorism, national security, all of those things. They're not a country that we typically rely on. There are other Latin American countries that are actually better at it that we rely on. So I don't think it was to get, this free access of information. If it was Saudi Arabia, yeah, perhaps, but it's not. And so I think it had to do with stuff and money. That's what I think.
Yeah. It was, I just couldn't put my finger on it. And normally, like, I feel like I'm a very level thinker on this whole subject. And I kept thinking, like, I don't understand what the purposes of this. I don't see it. It didn't make sense. And so it's just confusing.